Well, thank you. We have these two speakers. Some other speakers for several reasons could not, after all, make it. So it means that we have more time for discussion and debate, which is fortunate in a way. I would like us to think about this section now, not as only questions to the presenters, but also a moment where you can intervene. This is a global forum, so it's a discussion. You can tell your own experiences, opinions, and also obviously ask questions. I think I could use these statues around here to say that what you see in those statues is actually what happens to people that don't make any questions or interventions in this kind of debate, so be careful. So could first intervention question from anyone?
So in the first place, I would like to post a sort of question for all of you, in fact, regarding the use of digital instruments in museums nowadays, and how, nowadays we are very used to seeing people who are sitting in a restaurant and they are not looking at each other, they are looking at the screens of their cell phones. And how can we from the institutions, while at the same time giving them this information and this accessibility to our information, how to avoid having them live through their instruments rather than using them? If you have any thoughts on the matter.
I will try to give my opinion on that. I believe this is a true problem. Do you hear me? Yeah. I think this is a true problem that has to do with the user experience that technologies can provide, and requires that the introduction of technologies in a museum context should not be only a technological problem. In other words, we should take into account what we expect from users' behaviors, what will be probably the user behaviors, and having precise goal that should not be, in my opinion, that of being up to date, so providing technological solutions, but indeed should be using technology to give more. In other words, more information, more in-depth information, more cultural experience. So the problem that you mentioned is a true problem and has to do what is the right way to provide content to users. Probably I agree that if I have a tablet or a smartphone, that provide me information, I look at the smartphone and not at the artwork. So probably audio is a better feature to use in that sense, because you can join both the visual and the audio experience together. But of course, the same problem you have when you have a textual guide. You look at the guide, you read, and at that time you don't look at the artwork. So, in other words, it's a big problem that has to be investigated, but it's a real problem. So, I don't have the solution, probably from site to site could be different, but for sure is a problem to address in some way to answer.
Certainly, the use of audio instead of reading, or even video supports that are becoming more and more popular, is very useful in that sense. You know, orienting our communications in that way rather than, you know, a full media on your tablet, on your instrument, while you're at the very museum. Also, this brings up the subject of being selective with the information that we are giving the visitor. I mean, obviously, it is very interesting to have an online or available globally all the information that we can, you know, in the context of open licensing and so forth. But to be selective in the context that we are providing the visitor in our institution when they are, you know, experiencing the museum itself.
Yeah, I want to add something, this interesting point. Probably, at least I tried to give you an idea of what can be done today. You can build, let's say, intelligent environment to some extent, of course. In other words, environments that understand what you do, what you look at. So these environments can be responsive, can provide some feedback to you, some information. There are few problems when this information is given. For example, if I'm looking at an artwork, but I'm not alone, I'm with a person, and I'm exchanging my experience with that person, probably will be disturbed from a system that provide me in-depth information, because I'm just exchanging an experience. So that is a problem. Another problem is that, well, what is my cultural background? And based on that, I should like to receive information that is adequate to my background. That means that, in other words, I should be profiled correctly and given the adequate information. This is a very big issue with several other implications. So there are many, many open problems that we have not addressed so far, but that technology will push to address and give some answer.
I couldn't agree more. Oh, sorry.
I just add some small things to Professor said, that I believe, as I told in my presentation, that the use of ICTs and the videos and the images, this is greatly increasing the understanding of the context of the material culture, meaning that in many ethnographical museums now that they are using, not only presenting the object as object, but they also relate this object with relating performance, for instance, so that the visitors can understand, for instance, the example of the African mask. These are not the aesthetic objects for these people. These are the things which are used in their ritual lives and community lives. So it enables us to understand in a deeper manner what is the context of this object. So in this sense, I think the use of ICTs and in museums are really greatly contributing to the deeper understanding of the background of object, and to allow ourselves to get out from these material-oriented approaches of museums. But yesterday, as we discussed with Dr. Longo and the other friends, it's also, as Professor said, it increases also the work of ourselves in museums, because we have to provide different levels of information to different kind of publics. The generation of my parents, they don't use, the mobile devices. They still read, and they complain that it's too small, the letters. They want to have bigger letters to read more easily. And the generation of my son, who is 9 years old, they are already, you know, that every day manipulating his tablet and the Nintendo DS. So these are the great gap between these generations in terms of information and type of information required. So I think this is a big challenge for museums. We need more people and we need more fund.
Yes, my question was regarding these cameras following visitors through the museum and presuming that a man who spends more time in front of one Donatello's, I don't know, sculpture, or if I go to the Medici Chapel and stand in front of the Michelangelo sculptures, that I need and I want an additional and in-depth information. I don't want it. I don't need it, but I like to be left alone and to study the thing I admire, the genius work, so I know a lot of that artifact. But I still spent a lot of time in front of it. So it doesn't need, I don't need additional and more in-depth information. So it may be mistaken to presume a visitor that spends a lot of time in front of one work needs some additional and wants some additional information. Perhaps he just wants to admire the work.
Yeah. I agree. We are going to publish an article on IEEE Multimedia on this topic that will be published in 1 month from now. And this is, again, another true problem. For example, a visitor does not want to be observed, does not want to be profiled, and wants to be left alone to live his or her experience in front of an artwork. So this is a problem that can be technologically solved, but that must be addressed by museums, because it's clear that these kind of technologies must be person respectful, not only from the privacy viewpoint, that is an issue, but also from the fact that I don't want to be observed or profiled, and you know, in other words, I don't care about technology and their facilities. So it's true. It's
Hi there. Whoa, that one's loud. So given what you've just said, I wonder why the architecture that you're considering is for the museum to watch the patron and make suggestions, rather than for the patron to have all the information about the museum on her mobile device, on the grounds that that mobile device is only going to get more capacious and will soon be able to hold every fact about your museum forever. And then the mobile device knows about its owner, and the mobile device decides among all of that information what to show to the owner. And that's a much more future-proof approach, I would think, because you're not aiming for a specific target, a specific mobile device. What you're saying is that in general, mobile devices will know about their owners, and mobile devices will have a means of communicating with their owners. And our job is to make sure the mobile device knows everything so it can choose what to show to the owner.
What's the question?
The question is, why is the architecture follow around the user and derive and make predictions about the user and then provide timely information, rather than provide the user with all of the information and then ask the mobile device to filter it on the user's behalf?
Well, sometimes you could be overwhelmed by information, you know. In other words, consider a town like Florence, or a museum in Florence, like the Uffizi, and consider a standard visitor, let's say with an average cultural background, never been in Florence, so relatively knowing the history of Western artworks. So probably he will visit with a lot of attention the first 2 rooms. In the third, his or her attention will decay. In the very end, he will miss all the other rooms. Just not because the 15th century or the 16th century are less interesting than the 20th or the 13th, but because he's tired and just started to give his or her willingness, so devoted himself to observations in the very beginning, and in the end is exhausted and does not has no other energy to spend.
I think I may have been unclear. Do you mind if I just interject here? I don't mean that you should tell the user everything about everything. I meant that the user's device should know everything about everything, and the user's device has a very fine-grained sense of how attentive the user is. And it is not a privacy invasion for my device to know exactly where I'm standing if it doesn't tell anyone else. And so for my device to say, I'm standing here and I'm looking at this painting, and my device knows something about the painting, is much less invasive than for my device to say, I'm standing here, hey museum, what painting am I in front of?
Yeah, you know, can be done, of course. Can be done. Yeah, it's a different approach, pros and cons, as everywhere.
Thank you.
Along these lines, if I can, I think that sometimes we are looking at the visitors, and we tend to do that, and when I say we, it's because I also work in the museums, in a very passive way. And my question is, do you know of, or does anyone here is engaged or know of projects, for instance, where co-creation, the use of the web for co-creation of exhibitions? I mean, instead of just using these new instruments to address the visitor as kind of an anonymous person, to use these to gather information from the visitors, not only to provide to the visitors, but to gather information from the visitors in terms of, I would be interested in this, I have my background which could contribute to a different interpretation of this object or this painting or this reality. Just to give you an example, for instance, recently in the Science Museum in London, just 2 weeks ago, they have this kind of very interesting area where they invited the visitors to tell stories about the radio that they're looking at, about the computer or the old calculator they are looking at, and to provide their own experience, and they are turning this into an exhibition. So I'm not that familiar with this, if there is anything of the kind in terms of using and gathering this and empowering the visitor to actually change a little bit the practices of a museum, such an art museum. I don't know if anyone knows about this.
Well, yes, I agree with almost all the exchange that we made. And I was telling this morning, I think that the goal that contemporary museums are actually challenging to reach is actually to create this permeability, within among the two people. So we, from inside the museums, we should provide any kind of information, and maybe all these devices can be a mean to an end, okay, but not the goal in itself. And the possibility of interacting with the visitors is the new way that new generation, different publics, are actually asking to us, because we are really facing a different way. People is coming to our museums and wants to interact with our museums. Up to now, we are used to people that are really, kind of scared about museums somehow. They are reaching the museums, they are coming to the museum. Well, what I noticed, for example, that even within this kind of audience, nobody, just take a look of a Michelangelo that we have here, So I should have told them, or maybe if by their mobile devices they were just coming through here and the mobile was just popping up something and say, oh, hi, I am Michelangelo, If you want to give a look to me, it's okay. If you don't, okay. I just tell you something, And you can decide if you want to utilize more information or you don't, okay? So we should make our visitors we provide them the freedom to know more about what they are visiting, or just, emotionally visiting a place, What technology is actually giving us is to enlarge our vision, as I was telling this morning. I think that museum design should change their own DNA in order to approach, the way in which we communicate what we have. I cannot change this room, but I can improve, and I can go, towards people who maybe is asking for question that I would never even think about. But they can find the information if they want. So, again, technology can help actually, but we should be, in balance in giving information and letting people choose among this panel of information.
Probably, I think your question was a little bit wider, and if I understood your question, it was, can we exploit social connectivity?
Basically this, technology enables us, whatever we're talking about, this communication technology enables us to engage in both directions.
Sure.
Usually museums are one-directional, traditionally, and now we have a huge potential of making things bidirectional. That's what I would like
it's a very good point. I think there are some experiences. I have read, not verified, that MoMA made something like that in New York. They made, they also allowed, also exhibits provided by users, by visitors, using the web. So web connectivity and, of course, moderated by MoMA, but they allowed to build events, collective events. So it's true, technology allows the relationship between visitor and museum not being unidirectional, but bidirectional, and under control can also allow to extend the museum beyond the walls of the museum. Of course, I would say that technologies are not flowers. In other words, they can flourish and provide something more, but they also provide risks, challenges, and troubles. So must be managed carefully. That's my opinion.
I also have a small comment about this, that I remember some years ago that I was informed by one of the American institutions which has an important collections from Alaska, or the Yes, and they introduced an innovative system of recording the people's impression, the descendant of the people who fabricated the objects, and so museum sent a mission to this place and to record the comments of the people on the spot. What is their impression about the object and what is their interpretation of objects. So it was a very interesting things that we see, these videos and comments in front of the object. But this also, I remember, created some kind of tension between this allegedly original communities and scientific communities, because I think the use of ICTs and this bilateral way of fabricating the new way of exhibiting things, also blurring the demarcation between scientific expertise of museum professionals and the fundamental mission of museums, of scientific researches, and the role of communities which are connected with the objects. So I think this is also a very important and lasting debate that we continue with the introduction of the ICTs in the museums.
Still have time for a few more questions.
I would like to post just for Professor De Bimbo a little question about an issue that, watching your presentation did arise, that it did have, the slight impression that the individual privacy of the visitor was being vulnerated in some way. He was being followed and he was being observed. It did look a little bit like Big Brother or something like that. I understand that this is completely anonymous, that it is processed by the computer, and there is no way, that you can individualize each and every person by their name. Obviously, from the institutional side, every and each and one of us would like to know who the visitor is, what he knows, what he likes. And this is a step forward in that sense. And I think that, the first impressions might be a little bit scary, but I think that it's a very, very interesting program. The possibility of knowing what the visitor is interested in, and with this information, to be able to design your exhibition and to direct your visitors to other works or other objects that you may have that are being not valued as they may be, and it shows great potential in this sense.
The internet was started in the 90s, and since 10 years each of ours is constantly observed. In the last few years, technologies allow to observe you in a continuous way, especially if you have devices like this. So there are, I told you, 6 billion estimated devices here and where. Many of them are cameras. In London, there are a huge number of cameras everywhere. For example, is the highest number of cameras installed worldwide. In airports, there are. In museums, there are for a lot of cameras. So people is constantly observed. The internet permits to track digital data, collect digital data, and smart processing of this data provides hints that are relatively precise. So, in fact, you can see that if you buy something on Amazon, then you are suggested of things that most of the times fit your desire. So, that is profiling engines. So, this is some way disturbing, and of course can be used in a malicious way, or socially debatable way. But this is a matter of regulations, law, that should protect the individual from the malicious use of this information. For sure, today, and tomorrow much more than today, technology will permit constant following of individuals in their activities and intelligent processing of this data. So this is a problem that must be solved from the political and legal side. But it's a true problem.
If I may add also on something on this, sometimes we tend to think that these problems are new and are because of the new technologies. And sometimes we forget about old and simple things. Just the other day I was having this discussion with someone that was telling me and complaining, look, now with this new thing on Facebook, I think it was on Facebook, everyone can know, if I put it there, everyone can know my phone number, my mobile phone number. And I was saying, well, we used to have something called the phone book, where everyone could have access to my phone and to my address, and no one would complain about that. So it's most of the time it's nothing new, and actually I think that in this respect about privacy, it's one of the things that is good, is that before access to data was not of the public domain, but now the access itself is becoming public domain, and so it's much more easily, we know that it can be used, we know that there is access, and it's not just someone that is having access, we all can. So, well, I don't know if there is any other question? One more?
I would just like, to expand a little bit on the subject of context, which is something that all three of you have mentioned, and the importance of contextualizing works when you are in a museum and letting the visitor know about, the ways in which a certain object was used, or let's take this room, for example, its own history, like the evolution of the building, how Leonardo started painting a fresco, and set it all in motion, and giving the opportunity to the visitor to have an immersive experience with the object and understanding the object in itself, rather than the more classical approach of a freezer for culture, when the object is just placed and preserved for eternity in a white room where nothing happens to it and where time stops. And in this sense, augmented reality, videos, and well, we've seen downstairs, and we saw yesterday reproductions with 3D printers of archaeological artifacts that bring to light the possibility of showing how an object was used and experimenting with it, and allowing the visitor to gain direct access to that information, which is, I think, more interesting than seeing an object in itself.
Totally agreement with that. In the last project that I showed you, the one that will start soon, particularly augmented reality is used in this sense. Will give information about the history of a manufacture, how it has been built, how was in the very beginning, how was developed through times. That, in other words, provides emotions, and of course provides also additional information, contextual information. That's very important. In summary, we should say that, for example, personally, I am very against gamification and much more in favor of in-depth information from the historical and content viewpoint.
I agree totally with you also, and not only in the context of the museums, but also in the context of a town like Florence, because it was founded by Romans, then the Middle Age, Renaissance, and all these thick layers of history everywhere in the town. And when I read a guidebook, I don't really grasp everything of these layers and this living, history of the town. So I think the mobile devices and information also contributes to accumulate this kind of thicker and deeper information and experience of visitors, for sure, because the book is, it's really, I remember one experience in a church in Rome that it was founded in the Greek, originally as the temple of Mitra, and then it was converted in Christian church, and then it was converted in something else. And if you do not really read in depth this thick guidebook, you don't know it's forever. So I think the mobile devices, it will facilitate also in record speed the access to these thick layers of information that it enriches your experience.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you for you all for the contribution to the discussion.